Take my fat wife, the corrupt judge laughed. But in the silence of the dusty street, a poor mountain man stood tall and said, "I'll show her true love." The crowd roared with laughter. The church bell tolled, and a woman, mocked and broken, was handed away like property. But what no one knew was that inside her satchel lay stolen deeds, proof of the judge's darkest crime. Now, hunted by riders, the outcast mountain man and the cast-off wife must fight for dignity, justice, and a love that could change an entire town. Chains will rattle in the jail. Hooves will thunder across the frozen hills. And in the glow of a lantern, secrets too dangerous to hide will finally come to light. When power and corruption choke the land, can one woman's courage and one man's vow of true love bring redemption, or destroy them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through the heavy oak doors of Silver Bluffs Courthouse, late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across rough-hewn floorboards. Dust motes danced in golden shafts that pierced the stuffy air, where the scents of tobacco, leather, and unwashed bodies mingled. The day's heat had driven folks to crowd inside for the afternoon's proceedings, their boots scraping against wood as they shifted restlessly. Judge Horace Barrow sat elevated behind his broad desk, his jowled face reddened from both the warmth and his own savage amusement. Before him stood Tom Wesley, a weather-beaten rancher whose shoulders slumped under the weight of drought and debt. The man's calloused hands twisted his worn hat, knuckles white with tension. "Your Honor," Wesley pleaded, "just need more time to pay. The creeks run dry and without water rights." "Silence!" Barrow's fist crashed down, making the inkwell jump. "You've had 3 months to settle your debt. The law's the law." His thin lips curved in a cruel smile as his gaze swept the packed room. "Unless someone here wants to clear his debt? $30 ain't much to some of you fine gentlemen." Near the back wall, Michael Pike stood quietly observing. His buckskins carried the fresh scent of pine sap, marking him as newly arrived from the high country. Though his face remained still, his jaw tightened at the judge's mocking tone. A heavy woman in a faded blue dress sat to the judge's right, head bowed as she recorded the proceedings in a leather-bound ledger. Her movements were precise, but held a tremor that spoke of long-suffering dignity. Perhaps Barrow's voice dripped with sudden venom. "My dear wife would care to offer an opinion?" He turned to the woman, who stiffened but didn't look up. "Come now, Liza. Share your thoughts with the good people of Silver Bluff." Liza's quill paused mid-stroke. "I don't believe my opinion is relevant to these proceedings, Your Honor," she said softly, each word measured and careful. "No?" Barrow's face darkened. "Why, you're right about that. Your opinions ain't worth the paper you're writing on." He leaned back, spreading his arms wide. "Tell you what, Wesley. Take my fat wife if you want her. She's worth less than the debt you owe." Raucous laughter erupted from the crowd. Men elbowed each other, some spitting tobacco juice on the floor as they guffawed. Wesley's face reddened, but he kept his eyes down, shame and relief warring in his expression as attention shifted from his troubles. But Liza didn't cry. She didn't flee. She simply sat, straight-backed, her quill moving again across the page as though recording her own humiliation for posterity. Only the whiteness of her knuckles betrayed her pain. Michael's hands had curled into fists at his sides. He'd seen much in his years in the mountains: grizzly bears, avalanches, the fierce winter storms that could freeze a man solid. But this casual cruelty struck him as something worse, something that needed facing down just as surely as any natural threat. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he stepped forward. Conversations quieted as people noticed his movement, the laughter dying away. Even Judge Barrow's smile faltered slightly at the sight of the tall trapper's weathered face and steady gaze. "I'll take her." Michael's voice was quiet but carried clearly in the sudden silence. It wasn't the voice of a man making a joke or seeking attention. It was the voice of someone stating a simple truth, like commenting on approaching weather. Barrow's smile returned wider than ever. "What's that, mountain man? Speak up." "I said I'll take her." Michael moved closer to the judge's desk, his steps deliberate, but not as a joke, and not as payment for any debt. He turned slightly, meeting Liza's startled eyes. If she'll have me, I'll take her as my wife. I'll show her the love and respect she deserves. The silence deepened. Someone's spurs jingled as they shifted uncomfortably. Liza's quill had stopped moving entirely, spots of ink bleeding into the page where it rested. Barrow's face flushed darker, but he kept his mocking tone. You hear that, Liza? The trapper wants to make you his squaw, though I don't reckon you'd fit in his cabin. Fresh laughter rippled through the crowd, but it was uncertain now, with an edge of unease. Michael didn't look away from Liza. Ma'am, he said softly, I know we're strangers, but I've got a good cabin up Ghost Creek way. It's simple, but it's clean and warm. There's game aplenty, and I do right well with my trap lines. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I can't offer you fancy things, but I can promise you'll never hear a cruel word under my roof, and you'll be treated with the dignity God meant for all his children. Liza's eyes had grown wide, searching Michael's face as though looking for the joke, the trap, the hidden cruelty. But she found only sincerity in his steady gaze, and the way he stood, patient and unashamed, before the entire town. This is absurd. Barrow's voice cracked like a whip. You think my wife would leave her comfortable home for some mountain man's hovel? She's clerk of this court. Seems to me, Michael said mildly, that the lady can speak for herself. He held out his hand toward Liza, palm up. An invitation, not a demand. The room held its breath. Liza looked at Michael's offered hand, strong, calloused, bearing the small scars of his trade. Then she looked at her husband, whose face had twisted into something ugly and familiar. Finally, she looked down at the ledger before her, where she had recorded years of her husband's corrupted justice and her own humiliation. With deliberate care, she set down her quill. She closed the ledger. And then, moving with the quiet dignity she had never fully lost, Liza Barrow stood up. I accept your offer, Mr. Pike, she said clearly. A few gasps broke the silence. Judge Barrow's face went from red to purple. You can't be serious, he sputtered. This is dash. You offered me to any man who'd take me, Liza interrupted, her voice gaining strength. In front of witnesses. Well, a good man has offered, and I accept. She stepped down from the clerk's position, her skirts rustling. Michael moved to meet her, positioning himself slightly between her and the judge. His hand remained extended, and when she took it, his grip was gentle but sure. Together, they turned toward the courthouse doors. This is nonsense, Barrow shouted. I'll have you both arrested. For what crime? Michael asked quietly. You gave permission in front of the whole town. Unless you're saying your own words from the bench don't carry legal weight. That brought Barrow up short. His authority rested on his judicial pronouncements being binding. If he denied the validity of his own declaration, even one made in jest, it would undermine every judgment he'd ever handed down. The crowd parted as Michael and Liza walked toward the exit. Some men touched their hats in grudging respect. Others looked away, shame finally touching their faces, as they recognized their part in years of cruelty. Just before they reached the doors, Michael paused and looked back at the assembled townspeople. Much obliged for the introduction to my future wife, he said mildly. Good day to you all. Then he guided Liza out into the late afternoon sun, his broad shoulder shielding her from the curious stares that followed. The heavy doors swung shut behind them with a solid thud, leaving Judge Barrow speechless on his bench and the crowd murmuring in amazed disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The story opens with Michael's bold act of courage and compassion, standing against the town's casual cruelty to defend a woman's dignity. His simple, steadfast offer of respect and protection to Liza marks the beginning of their journey together, though neither yet knows where that journey will lead. In this moment, witnessed by all of Silver Bluff, Michael's quiet strength and Liza's rediscovered courage have already begun to challenge the corrupt power structure that Judge Barrow represented. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's muddy Main Street as Michael and Liza made their way from the courthouse. Their footsteps squelched in the spring mud, and somewhere in the distance, a mine whistle marked the changing of shifts. Michael kept his pace steady but unhurried, mindful of Liza beside him. "My cabin's just beyond the edge of town," he said softly, breaking their silence. "It's about a 20-minute walk, if you're agreeable to that." Liza nodded, keeping her eyes fixed on the ground. Her hands trembled where they clutched her shawl, and Michael noticed she was taking short, careful breaths, as though trying not to cry. They passed the general store, where the shopkeeper's wife quickly pulled her curtains shut at the sight of them. Outside the saloon, a group of miners stopped their conversation to stare. Michael positioned himself between them and Liza, shielding her from their curious gazes. As they reached the town's edge, the packed dirt of the street gave way to a narrow trail winding up through scattered ponderosa pines. The spring evening was cooling rapidly, and the wind carried the sharp scent of snow from the high peaks. "Watch your step here," Michael warned gently as they crossed a small stream. He offered his arm for balance but didn't press when Liza managed on her own, picking her way carefully across the stones. His cabin came into view as they crested a small rise, a simple log structure with a metal stovepipe jutting from its roof. A small barn stood nearby, and a stack of split wood lined one wall. It wasn't much, but it was solid and well-maintained. Michael saw Liza's shoulders tense as they approached the door. Her breathing had grown more rapid, and he could sense her fear, the expectation that once they were out of sight, his kind demeanor would vanish like morning mist. He stopped a few paces from the cabin. "Mrs. Barrow," he said quietly, making sure to keep his distance. "I meant what I said in town. You're safe here. I know you've no reason to trust that yet, but I aim to prove it true." Liza's eyes darted to his face, then away again. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you?" She couldn't finish the question. Michael was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Because what was happening in that courthouse wasn't right. And sometimes a man has to stand against what isn't right, even if he doesn't rightly know what comes after." He moved to the cabin door, opening it and stepping back. "Would you like to come in? I've got some venison stew left from this morning. You're welcome to share it if you're hungry." The cabin's single room was neat but spare. A iron cookstove occupied one corner, while a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt stood in another. A rough-hewn table held a lamp and some basic dishes. There was only one chair, a ladderback rocker with a worn cushion. Michael busied himself with the stove, giving Liza space to take in her surroundings. He added wood to the banked coals and soon had a cheerful fire crackling. The pot of stew he'd mentioned was set to warm, and he lit the lamp as the daylight outside began to fade. "Please," he said, gesturing to the rocker, "take the chair. I'm used to the stool." Liza sank into the rocker, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Michael could see she was still trembling slightly, though whether from cold or emotion, he wasn't sure. He ladled stew into 2 tin bowls and offered her one with a spoon. "It's not fancy," he apologized, settling onto the 3-legged stool, "but it's hot and filling." They ate in silence for a while, broken only by the pop of the fire and the distant cry of a hawk. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the cabin grew cozy with warmth and lamplight. Finally, Michael set his empty bowl aside. "I reckon you might be wondering about me," he said. "It's only fair you know something of the man whose cabin you're in." Liza looked up, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. "I had a wife years back," he continued, his voice soft with old grief. "Sarah was her name. We came out here together, built this cabin together. She took sick with mountain fever 4 years ago this spring." He paused, running a hand over his weathered face. "After she passed, I didn't reckon I'd ever speak kindly to another woman. Didn't think I had it in me anymore." "I'm sorry," Liza whispered, "about your wife." Michael nodded his thanks. "What happened today, seeing how they treated you in that courthouse, it wasn't right. No person deserves that kind of shame, least of all someone who's shown nothing but grace under it." Liza's hands tightened around her bowl. "I've been a burden my whole life," she said, her voice barely audible. "Too big, too plain, too—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Judge Barrow made sure I never forgot it. Made sure nobody else did, either." "You're not a burden," Michael said firmly. "You're a child of God, same as any of us, and you deserve to be treated with dignity." A tear slipped down Liza's cheek, falling into her stew. She set the bowl aside quickly, wiping her face with trembling fingers. The wind had picked up outside, and coyotes began their evening chorus in the distance. Michael rose and added another log to the fire, then gathered some extra blankets from a chest. "You take the bed," he said, spreading a thick wool blanket on the plank floor near the stove. "I'll be comfortable enough down here." Liza stared at him in surprise. "But it's your bed." "And you're my guest," he said simply. "I've slept rough plenty of times on my trap lines. This is luxury compared to that." He turned his back, giving her privacy to ready herself for sleep. The cabin's single window showed only darkness now, and the wind's moan was punctuated by the coyotes' wild songs. "Mr. Pike?" Liza's voice was small in the dimness. "Yes? Thank you." The words caught in her throat, heavy with shame and budding hope. "For everything. You're welcome, Mrs. Barrow. Sleep well." Michael banked the fire for the night, then settled onto his blanket. Outside, the mountain wind continued its ancient conversation with the coyotes, while inside the cabin, two lonely souls began the careful work of learning to trust again. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-capped summits in shades of rose and gold. Michael Pike woke with the first light, as was his habit from years of trapping. His back was stiff from sleeping on the floor, but he moved quietly, not wanting to wake Liza, who still slept in his bed, her breathing soft and even. The morning air held a sharp chill. Michael pulled on his worn leather coat and boots, then slipped outside to tackle the day's first task. The woodpile needed replenishing. He'd been meaning to do it for days, and now with Liza here, keeping the cabin warm seemed even more important. The rhythmic thunk of his axe split the morning silence. Each swing sent wood chips flying as he worked steadily, his breath forming clouds in the cool air. The physical labor helped clear his mind, letting him process the strange turn his life had taken yesterday. Inside the cabin, Liza woke to the distant sound of chopping. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then, yesterday's events came rushing back. The humiliation at the courthouse, Michael's unexpected intervention, and his gentle kindness afterward. She rose carefully, smoothing the quilt before folding it neatly at the foot of the bed. The floor was cold under her feet as she moved to the stove, where she found kindling and matches laid out thoughtfully. Soon she had a fire crackling, warming the small space. Looking around in the growing light, Liza noticed details she'd missed the night before. The cabin was simple, but well kept. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, and tin cans lined wooden shelves in neat rows. Everything had its place, speaking to Michael's orderly nature. She found coffee beans and a grinder in a corner cupboard, along with some dried biscuits and preserves. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared breakfast, grateful to have something useful to do. The familiar tasks helped steady her nerves. Michael returned, arms full of split wood, just as she was setting 2 tin cups of coffee on the table. He paused in the doorway, surprised by the transformed cabin. The room was warm and filled with the aroma of coffee, and Liza had somehow managed to make his sparse belongings look more homelike. "Good morning," she said softly, not quite meeting his eyes. "I hope you don't mind. I found the coffee." "Not at all," he replied, stacking the wood carefully by the stove. "It smells mighty fine." They sat down to breakfast, the silence between them more comfortable than the night before. Michael noticed how precisely Liza moved, her actions expressing a quiet competence that belied her husband's cruel mockery. Though her hand still trembled slightly when she passed him the preserves, there was an underlying strength in her bearing that he hadn't noticed yesterday. "Mr. Pike," she said suddenly, setting down her coffee cup, "I need to ask a favor." "Of course, yet there's something I need to retrieve from the courthouse. Some papers from my husband's desk." Her voice grew firmer as she continued. "He never locked his drawers because he never thought I'd dare touch anything. But these papers, they're important." Michael studied her face carefully. It could be dangerous going back there. "He'll be holding court all morning," Liza explained, "and I know exactly where to look." Michael nodded slowly. "All right, we'll go together." They made their way into town as the morning crowd began to gather. True to Liza's prediction, Judge Barrow's booming voice could be heard through the courthouse windows, berating some unfortunate defendant. Michael stood watch while Liza slipped inside through a side door. She returned quickly, clutching a bundle wrapped in her shawl. They hurried back to the cabin, where Liza spread the papers across the table with trembling fingers. "These are water rights deeds," she explained, pointing to the official stamps and signatures. "And these are the ledgers showing how he obtained them." Her voice grew hard. "He forced people to sign them over. Ranchers who needed loans, miners who got in trouble with the law. He'd offer them a choice between jail and signing away their water rights." Michael picked up one of the documents, reading carefully. "Mason Creek water rights. Isn't that the Thompson family's land?" Liza nodded. "They lost their son in a mining accident last year. Judge Barrow told Mrs. Thompson he'd make sure she got the widow's pension if she signed over their water rights. But the pension never came." "And you know all this because I was his clerk," Liza said quietly. "He liked to mock my intelligence in public, but he used it when it suited him. I kept his records, wrote his letters, tracked his schemes. He never thought I understood what I was recording. Or maybe he just didn't care." Michael's weathered face grew grave as he examined more documents. "There must be 20 deeds here. He's been strangling the whole valley, piece by piece." "These prove it was all done under duress," Liza said. "The dates, the coinciding court cases, the sudden dismissal of charges after the deeds were signed, it's all here in black and white." "This could free a lot of good folks from his grip," Michael said slowly. He looked up at Liza, concern etching his features. "But it could also get us both killed. Maybe we should burn them. Stay safe." "No." Liza's voice was firm, though her hands shook as she gathered the papers. "I've stayed silent too long, watched too many people suffer. The truth needs to come out." Michael saw the determination in her eyes, the same quiet strength he'd noticed earlier now blazing forth. This was no longer just about her escape from the judge. She was choosing to stand against his corruption, whatever the cost. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's window, casting long shadows across the damning documents spread between them. Neither spoke for a long moment, both understanding they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The judge's cruelty toward his wife had been personal, but this was different. This was a direct challenge to his power, his carefully constructed web of corruption. "We'll need help," Michael said finally. "And a plan." Liza nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of a deed. "There are people in town who've lost everything to him. People who might be willing to speak up if they knew they weren't alone. And people who might want to silence us before we can say a word," Michael added grimly. He got up and added wood to the stove, buying time to think. "We'll need to be careful about who we trust." The light was fading now, the mountain shadows growing longer. Liza carefully stacked the papers, wrapping them back in her shawl. Her hands were steady now, despite the weight of their discovery. They sat in silence as evening settled over the cabin, each lost in thought. The documents lay between them like a powder keg, waiting to explode. Michael watched Liza across the table, seeing not the fearful woman from yesterday, but someone with steel in her spine and justice in her heart. The mountain wind whispered around the cabin's corners, carrying the first hints of night's chill. Inside, two people who had been alone yesterday found themselves united in a cause larger than themselves. Their separate paths now merged into one dangerous road. Dawn painted the Colorado mountains in soft gold and rose, the early light catching on morning dew. Michael Pike stood in his cabin's doorway, adjusting the worn leather straps on his mule's pack saddle. The old animal stomped patiently, used to the routine of hauling traps along mountain trails. "I'm coming with you," Liza said from behind him, her voice quiet but firm. Michael turned, surprised to find her already dressed for the trail. A gathering basket looped over her arm. She wore a faded calico dress that had seen better days, but she'd tied her hair back neatly under a sunbonnet. "It ain't safe," he said carefully, "with those papers we found. There are late summer berries up in the hills," she countered, "and herbs I can dry for winter. Besides," she hesitated, "I'd rather not stay here alone." Michael studied her face, noting the worry lines around her eyes despite her determined expression. After yesterday's discovery of the judge's corrupt dealings, they both knew danger lurked closer than the mountain's shadow. "All right," he agreed finally, "but we'll need to be careful." Stay close. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, Michael leading the mule while Liza walked beside him. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and sage. Their boots crunched softly on the rocky trail as it wound up into the timber. After checking his first trap line, Michael watched Liza gather bright red berries, her movements quick and sure. She seemed to know which plants to pick and which to avoid, showing the same quiet competence he'd noticed in the cabin. "My grandmother taught me about wild plants," she offered, catching his glance. "Before I was married. She knew all their uses, for food, for medicine." A shadow crossed her face. The judge called it foolish woman's knowledge. Michael secured a trap to the mule's pack before responding. "Ain't foolish to know how to survive." He paused, then added, "My Sarah, she knew plants too. Used to make the best willow bark tea when the fever seasons came." Liza straightened, berry juice staining her fingers. "Sarah was your wife?" He nodded, surprising himself by wanting to say more. "Lost her 3 winters ago. Fever took her fast before anyone could help." The old pain surfaced, familiar as his own heartbeat. "Thought I'd never speak kind to another woman after that." "I'm sorry," Liza said softly. She was quiet for a moment, then offered her own truth. "I never wanted to marry the judge. My father owed him money, and I was the payment." Her voice grew distant. "I was 17, too young to fight it, too old to cry about it." They walked in silence for a while, the mule's hooves marking time on the trail. The morning warmed around them as they climbed higher, checking traps and gathering nature's late summer bounty. Their quiet companionship felt easier now, shaped by shared stories and shared pain. Near midday, they stopped in a small clearing to rest. Michael passed Liza his canteen while she shared some dried apple slices she'd tucked in her pocket. The peaceful moment shattered when they heard horses approaching on the trail below. "Quick," Michael whispered urgently, pulling Liza into the brush. They crouched low, the mule thankfully hidden behind a stand of aspens. Hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by men's voices. Through gaps in the foliage, they could see 4 riders, men they recognized as Judge Barrow's hired hands. The men rode slowly, studying the ground, clearly searching for something or someone. "Had to have come this way," one rider was saying. "Judge wants them found before they can talk to anyone." "What about the woman?" another asked. "She ain't used to mountain living. Won't last long out here." "Judge said bring her back alive if we can. The trapper." The voice grew cold. "Well, accidents happen in these mountains all the time." Liza's hand found Michael's arm, gripping tight. They hardly dared breathe as the riders passed their hiding place. The men continued up the trail, their voices fading into the forest's whispers. Several long minutes passed before Michael signaled it was safe to move. They emerged from the brush, both shaken by the close call. Liza's face was pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "They're hunting us," and Michael nodded grimly, checking that the mule hadn't wandered. "Those papers we found, they're worth killing for." He helped Liza up, noting how her hands trembled despite her calm words. "We'd best head back, take a different trail down." They descended through thick timber, Michael choosing less traveled paths that would be harder to follow. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine boughs, but the golden light no longer felt welcoming. Every snapping twig made them pause. Every distant sound brought fresh tension. It was near sunset when they finally reached the cabin. Michael tended to the mule while Liza hurried inside to start a fire. The day's warmth was fading fast, bringing mountain chill with the growing darkness. Over a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they sat close to the stove, speaking in low voices about what they'd overheard. The danger felt more real now, no longer just a shadow but a tangible threat carried by armed men on horseback. "We've painted targets on our backs," Michael admitted, pushing his plate away. "Those deeds, they're proof of years of corruption. The judge won't let that stand." Liza nodded, her face troubled in the lamplight. "But we can't destroy them. Too many people have suffered under his greed." She looked down at her hands, still stained with berry juice. "I used to pray every night for God to deliver me from that marriage. Maybe he did, but not just for my sake." Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying the woman across from him. Yesterday she had been a stranger, the judge's ridiculed wife. Now she sat at his table, showing more courage than many men he'd known. "Been a long time since I prayed proper," he said finally. "Not since Sarah, but maybe we could pray together." Liza's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. They bowed their heads there at the rough table, while outside the mountain night pressed close around the cabin's walls. Michael's voice was rough but sincere as he spoke. "Lord, thank you for safe passage today. Thank you for—" He paused, then continued softly, "for new strength beside me." The words surprised him, even as he spoke them, but they felt true. "Amen," Liza whispered, and in the quiet that followed, something shifted between them. A deeper understanding, a shared faith rekindled in the face of danger. The lamp burned low as they prepared for sleep, each lost in thought about the day's events. The judge's men were searching, and sooner or later they would be found. But tonight, in the shelter of the cabin, they had found something unexpected. A companion in troubled times and perhaps the first whispers of providence at work in their lives. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft gold as Michael stepped out of the cabin. The morning air held the crisp bite of approaching autumn, making him pull his wool coat tighter. Behind him, Liza stirred at the stove, already preparing for the day ahead. "I'll be back before midday," he said, adjusting his hat. "You sure you'll be all right here alone?" Liza nodded, her face showing more confidence than yesterday. "I've got plenty to keep me busy. The cabin could use some proper bread, and I brought my sourdough starter." She hesitated, then added softly, "Be careful, Michael." He touched the folded papers in his coat pocket, documents that could change lives, or end them. The stolen deeds felt heavy with purpose. "I'll take the back trail, stay out of sight. Bolt the door behind me." The path to Caleb Hensley's ranch wound through dense pine forest, keeping Michael hidden from the main road. His boots made little sound on the needle-strewn earth as he picked his way carefully down the slope. Every snapping twig made him pause. Every distant sound brought his hand to the rifle slung across his back. The judge's men could be anywhere. The sun had climbed higher by the time he reached Hensley's property. The modest ranch spread across a small valley, a creek threading through pastures where cattle grazed. Michael remembered when this had been prime grazing land, before the judge's water rights scheme had nearly ruined Caleb. He found the rancher mending fence posts, his weathered hands working steadily with hammer and nails. Caleb looked up at Michael's approach, surprise crossing his face. "Pike, don't often see you this far from your trap lines." He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Heard talk in town about you and the judge's wife." "That's partly why I'm here." Michael glanced around before continuing. "Got something you need to see, Caleb." They moved to the shade of a large pine where Michael pulled out the carefully folded deed. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he took the paper, his eyes scanning the familiar boundaries of his own land. "This is," his voice caught, "this is my original water rights deed, the one the judge claimed was invalid 5 years ago." He looked up sharply. "Where did you get this?" "Liza, Mrs. Barrow, she kept records, found proof of what the judge has been doing to folks around here." Michael's voice was low but intense. "He's been stealing land and water rights for years, forcing people to sign them away under false pretenses." Caleb stared at the document, years of bitterness etching deep lines around his mouth. "I nearly lost everything. Had to sell half my herd just to keep going with the reduced water access." His fist clenched around the paper. "Does anyone else know about this?" "Not yet. But they need to." Michael met the rancher's gaze steadily. "Thought you might know who else needs to see their rightful deeds." "Quietly, mind you. The judge already has men searching the mountains for us." A slow fire kindled in Caleb's eyes. "Oh, I know exactly who needs to see these. The Matthews brothers lost their south pasture. Old Tom Wilson had to sell his place entirely. He carefully folded the deed, tucking it securely in his vest. We'll spread the word careful like, man to man, neighbor to neighbor." They talked a while longer, speaking in low voices about who could be trusted and who might still be in the judge's pocket. When Michael finally turned to leave, Caleb caught his arm. "Pike, thank you, and thank your wife too." Michael didn't correct the assumption about Liza. Something in his chest warmed at the words, even as he reminded himself of the danger they were in. He nodded and slipped back into the forest, taking an even more circuitous route home. Back at the cabin, Liza had transformed the simple space. Warm, yeasty smells filled the air, and flour dusted the rough wooden table. She looked up as Michael entered, her face flushed from the hot stove. "You're back safe," she said, relief clear in her voice. "I've been keeping busy." She gestured to 2 golden brown loaves cooling on the windowsill. "Found your flour stores and thought we could use something special today." Michael hung his coat by the door, breathing in the homey scent that had been absent from his cabin for so long. "Caleb has his deed," he said. "He'll pass word to others who lost their rights. Carefully, like we discussed." Liza nodded, her hands working steadily as she shaped another loaf. The truth needs to spread, but softly, like sourdough rising. She smiled at her own comparison. Sometimes the quietest changes are the strongest. Michael found himself drawn to the window, watching as she arranged the bread with sure movements. The afternoon light caught her hair, highlighting threads of amber he hadn't noticed before. When she caught him looking, her cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't turn away. "Would you like to try some?" she asked, cutting thick slices from one of the cooling loaves. "It's been years since I could bake properly." The judge, he said it was a waste of flour to make anything special. Michael accepted a piece, the crust crackling perfectly under his fingers. The first bite nearly stopped him in his tracks. It tasted like memories of home, of shared meals and simple pleasures long forgotten. He searched for words. "This is real fine bread, Liza." She beamed at the praise, cutting her own slice. They sat together at the table, sharing the warm bread and cool butter, talking about Caleb's reaction and their hopes for justice. For the first time since she'd arrived, Michael felt laughter bubble up naturally from his chest. Real, uninhibited joy at the simple pleasure of good bread and good company. And Liza, she smiled too, wide and genuine, without the shadow of shame that had haunted her features before. Her eyes crinkled at the corners as she described kneading the dough, her hands gesturing animatedly. She looked younger, freer, as if chains were falling away one link at a time. They were so absorbed in their shared moment of peace that they remained unaware of the storm brewing in town. In the dim interior of the Silver Bluff Saloon, Judge Barrow slammed his glass down on the scarred wooden bar, his face mottled with rage. "That mountain rat thinks he can steal my wife and my documents?" He glared at the circle of cronies gathered around him. Already heard whispers about deeds showing up. Hensley was strutting around like a rooster this afternoon. The men shifted uncomfortably, except for Wade Turner, the judge's most loyal enforcer. "What do you want us to do about it, Judge?" Barrow's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I want them found. I want those papers burned, and I want that trapper to learn what happens when you cross me." He drew himself up, his bulk imposing in the shadowy room. "I swear, by all that's holy, they'll regret the day they thought they could challenge my authority in this town." The afternoon sun continued to shine on the peaceful cabin in the mountains, where Michael and Liza shared their freshly baked bread, unaware of the gathering darkness below. Their simple act of sharing truth had struck a spark in the community, a spark that would soon burst into flame, for better or worse. The judge's threats hung in the stale saloon air, but up on the mountainside, Liza taught Michael how to tell when bread was baked just right by thumping its bottom. Their laughter mingled with the wind in the pines, a moment of grace before the coming storm. The Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight spilling over the mountain peaks like honey. Michael adjusted his faded but freshly pressed shirt, watching Liza pin up her hair in the cabin's small mirror. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes held determination. "You don't have to do this," Michael said softly. "We could wait." Liza secured the final pin and smoothed her simple brown dress. "The truth won't wait, Michael. Not anymore." She turned to face him, shoulders straight. "These people deserve to know what's been done to them." They walked the dirt path toward town together, their boots crunching on early frost. The white-painted church stood against the blue sky, its small bell tower reaching heavenward. Already, wagons and buggies clustered around it, while townspeople in their Sunday best climbed the wooden steps. Michael offered his arm as they approached, and Liza took it gratefully. The murmuring started as soon as they reached the churchyard. Women whispered behind their prayer books. Men stared openly, some hostile, others curious. A few nodded cautiously in greeting. At the church door, Preacher Roberts stood welcoming his flock. He was a thin man with kind eyes and graying hair. When Michael and Liza approached, he didn't hesitate. "Welcome, Brother Pike." He extended his hand to Michael, then turned to Liza. "Sister Barrow, it's good to see you here." "Thank you, Preacher," Liza said softly. "Though, I go by Pike now." The preacher's eyes widened slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Of course. Welcome, Sister Pike." They entered the church, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The whispers grew louder. Sarah Matthews, whose family had lost their south pasture, shifted to make room in her pew. Michael and Liza sat beside her, aware of every eye upon them. The morning light filtered through plain glass windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. The familiar scent of beeswax candles and old hymnals filled the air. Preacher Roberts made his way to the pulpit, and a hush fell over the congregation. "Let us begin with Amazing Grace," he announced, and the organ wheezed to life. As the congregation sang, Michael noticed how Liza's voice rose clear and strong beside him. He'd never heard her sing before. The hymn spoke of being lost and found, of grace that taught the heart to fear, and grace that freed from fear. The words seemed to take on new meaning as they filled the small church. When the last note faded, Preacher Roberts began his sermon about truth and justice, drawing from the prophet Amos. Michael wondered if the choice of topic was coincidence or divine providence. Either way, it strengthened Liza's resolve. As the sermon concluded, Liza squeezed Michael's hand and stood. "Preacher Roberts," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet church. "If I may address the congregation." A shocked silence fell. Women fanned themselves more vigorously. Men shifted in their seats. The preacher studied Liza for a long moment, then nodded. "The floor is yours, Sister Pike." Liza made her way to the front, clutching a folded document. Standing before the congregation, she unfolded the paper with steady hands. Michael could see her gathering her courage, like someone drawing water from a deep well. "For years," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I served as clerk to Judge Barrow. I witnessed and recorded his dealings. What I'm about to read is evidence of corruption that has hurt many families in the town." She held up the deed. "This is the original water rights agreement for the Matthews family property. Note the date, 3 years ago. Compare it to the new agreement the judge forced them to sign last year, cutting their water access in half. The original was never legally voided. It was hidden away, while good people suffered." Sarah Matthews gasped. Her husband Tom stood up, face flushed. "I knew it. We told everyone that deed was still valid, but the judge said we were lying." More murmurs rippled through the church. Liza continued, her voice clear and unwavering. "There are more, dozens more. The Wilsons, the Hensleys, the Coopers, all cheated, all threatened into silence. I kept quiet too long, showing more fear of man than faith in God's justice. I ask your forgiveness for my silence, and I ask your help in making things right." The church erupted in conversation. Some people stood, pointing fingers and raising voices. Others sat stone-faced, likely afraid of the judge's retaliation. A few nodded vigorously, already convinced. Michael watched it all from his pew, his heart swelling with pride at Liza's courage. When she returned to sit beside him, he gripped her hand tightly. She was trembling now, but her eyes shone with relief and purpose. Preacher Roberts had to rap his Bible against the pulpit several times to restore order. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, "we have heard serious accusations this morning. Let us proceed with wisdom and prayer, seeking God's guidance in this matter." But before he could continue, the church door burst open. Framed in the doorway stood Wade Turner, the judge's enforcer. His face was dark with anger. "Judge Barrow would like a word with his wife," he announced, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "I am not his wife anymore," Liza declared, her voice carrying clearly through the church. "And I have nothing to say to him." Through the open door, they could see Judge Barrow himself sitting in his fine buggy, his face purple with rage. He'd clearly been listening to every word. The sight of him watching the church like a spider in its web sent a chill through the congregation. Turner took a step forward, but several men stood up, including Tom Matthews and Caleb Hensley. They formed a subtle barrier between Turner and the pew where Michael and Liza sat. The tension in the church could have been cut with a knife. Preacher Roberts stepped down from his pulpit. "Brother Turner, this is God's house. I must ask you to take your business elsewhere." Turner's eyes narrowed, but even he seemed reluctant to start trouble in the church. After a long moment, he backed out, letting the door slam behind him. The rest of the service was subdued. As people filed out afterward, some hurried past Michael and Liza without making eye contact. Others stopped to whisper quick words of support or share their own stories of the judge's corruption. The division in the town was clear as day, those willing to stand up for justice and those too frightened to risk it. Tom Matthews approached them as they prepared to leave. "We're having a meeting tonight," he said quietly. "At our place. For anyone who wants to see their original deeds and discuss what to do next. Will you come?" Michael looked at Liza, who nodded. "We'll be there," he promised. They stepped out into the autumn sunlight. Judge Barrow's buggy was gone, but they could feel his presence lingering like a storm cloud over the town. The church bell rang out, clear and bright against the mountain sky, calling to mind higher justice than any earthly court. As they walked home, Michael and Liza discussed the morning's events in low voices. They knew they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The truth was out now, for better or worse. Some would stand with them, others would stand against them, and many would try to stay neutral, though neutrality itself was a choice that favored the powerful. "Are you afraid?" Michael asked as they climbed the path to the cabin. Liza considered the question carefully. "Yes," she admitted, "but not like before. It's different now. Before, I was afraid of living. Now, I'm just afraid of what might try to stop us from doing what's right." She squeezed his hand. "And I'm not alone anymore." Michael nodded, understanding completely. They had allies now, but they also had powerful enemies. The judge wouldn't take this humiliation lightly. The next few days would show who in Silver Bluff valued justice more than safety, truth more than comfort. The sun was setting as they reached the cabin, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. They had a few hours before the meeting at the Matthews place. A few hours to prepare for whatever came next, to pray for wisdom and courage, to gather their strength for the battles ahead. Dawn brought a bitter chill to Silver Bluff. Michael rose early, as was his habit, to stoke the cabin's dying fire. Liza was already up, kneading dough at the rough-hewn table. The morning light caught the flower dust dancing in the air, making it look like snow falling inside their humble home. "Reckon we stirred up quite a hornet's nest yesterday," Michael said softly, adding another log to the flames. Liza nodded, her hands never stopping their steady work. "Truth has a way of doing that," she replied, but it needed saying. The sudden thunder of hooves outside made them both freeze. Michael's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but before he could reach it, the cabin door burst open. Sheriff Elias Weller stood in the doorway, his badge catching the morning light. Behind him, 3 deputies fanned out, their hands hovering near their gun belts. "Michael Pike," the sheriff announced, his voice carrying an edge of resignation. "You're under arrest for theft of legal documents and conspiracy to defraud the court." Michael's jaw tightened. "Those papers ain't stolen, Sheriff. They're evidence of real theft by your employer." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Pike." Sheriff Weller wouldn't meet his eyes. He pulled a pair of iron shackles from his belt, the metal clinking ominously in the quiet cabin. Liza stepped forward, flour still coating her hands. "This is wrong, Elias, and you know it. Those deeds prove the judge's crimes. You've seen how he's been squeezing folks dry these past years." The sheriff's weathered face twitched. For a moment, something like shame crossed his features, but it vanished quickly. "Ma'am, please step aside. I'm just doing my job." "Your job?" Liza's voice rose. "Your job is to uphold the law, not help break it." One of the deputies moved toward Michael, but he raised his hands in surrender. "No need for rough handling," he said quietly. "I won't resist." The deputy roughly grabbed Michael's wrists, snapping the cold irons around them. The metal bit into his skin. but he kept his face neutral, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of seeing his discomfort. "Michael, no!" Liza screamed as they began leading him toward the door. She tried to push past the deputies, but Sheriff Weller held her back. "Don't," Michael called to her. "Stay strong. Remember what we talked about." Their eyes met across the cabin, and volumes passed between them in that single look. Liza's face was streaked with tears, but she stood straight and proud, even as the deputies marched Michael out into the cold morning air. Through the open door, she could see Judge Barrow sitting astride his horse, watching the proceedings with obvious satisfaction. His smile was cruel as he observed his wife's distress. "Justice will be served, dear wife," he called out mockingly. "Your mountain man will learn what happens to thieves in my court." Liza's hands clenched into fists at her sides, leaving white marks in the flour dust. "The Lord sees everything, Judge Barrow," she called back, her voice steady despite her tears. "Every deed, every lie, every act of cruelty. He sees it all." The judge's face darkened at her words, but he turned his horse away without responding. The deputies helped Michael onto a horse, his shackled hands making it awkward to mount. Sheriff Weller lingered for a moment at the cabin door. "I'm sorry, Liza," he muttered, so quietly she almost missed it. Then he too mounted up, and the whole group rode away toward town, leaving Liza alone in the doorway of the cabin. She watched until they disappeared around the bend, her mind already racing. The judge had struck back quickly, just as they'd feared he might. But she wouldn't let it end here. Moving with purpose, she went to the loose floorboard where they'd hidden the remaining deeds. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the precious documents and placed them carefully in her old leather satchel. The cabin felt desperately empty without Michael's steady presence. His coffee cup still sat on the table where he'd left it, half full and growing cold. Liza touched it gently, drawing strength from the simple evidence of his existence in her life. "Lord," she whispered, "give me courage. Show me the way forward." In town, Michael was led through the muddy street toward the jail, townsfolk gathering to watch the spectacle. Some looked away in shame, others whispered behind their hands. A few, like Tom Matthews and Caleb Hensley, stood with hard faces and clenched fists, clearly wanting to intervene but knowing it would only make things worse. The jail was a solid stone building with iron-barred windows, one of the first permanent structures built in Silver Bluff. The deputies marched Michael inside and down a short hallway to the cells. They removed his shackles only to lock him behind the heavy iron door of the smallest cell. "Court will convene tomorrow morning," Sheriff Weller informed him gruffly. "Judge Barrow wants this dealt with quickly." "I'm sure he does," Michael replied evenly. "Easier to bury the truth that way." The sheriff didn't respond, just turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Soon, Michael was alone in the dim cell, with only a narrow shaft of sunlight streaming through the high window for company. He lowered himself onto the thin mattress that served as a bed, his joints protesting the cold dampness of the cell. But instead of giving in to despair, he closed his eyes and began to pray. "Lord," he whispered into the silence, "protect Liza. Give her wisdom, and help me trust in your timing, even here in this dark place." Back at the cabin, Liza was moving with quiet determination. She packed the satchel with care, the deeds, some bread, a water skin, and a few other necessities. She knew she needed to get these documents to higher authorities, perhaps the circuit judge in Denver, or even the territorial governor, someone who wasn't in Judge Barrow's pocket. As evening approached, she built up the fire one last time, though her heart ached at the thought of Michael spending the night in that cold cell. Kneeling before the hearth, she joined her prayers with his, though separated by stone walls and iron bars. "Father God," she prayed, her voice barely a whisper above the crackling flames, "we need your help now. Show us the path through this valley. Protect Michael. Let truth prevail against lies. Give me the courage to do what must be done." The fire popped and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying a deeper chill than before. Liza went to the window and saw the first few snowflakes beginning to fall, dark against the gathering dusk. In his cell, Michael too noticed the snow, watching through his high window as the flakes swirled past. Winter was coming early to Silver Bluff this year. He thought of Liza alone in their cabin and prayed she would stay warm and safe through the night. The snow fell silently over the town, covering everything in a thin white blanket: the muddy streets, the false-fronted buildings, the cabin in the woods, and the stone walls of the jail. It fell on the just and the unjust alike, as if nature itself was trying to cover over the day's sins with a clean sheet of white. But under that pristine surface, nothing had changed. In his comfortable house, Judge Barrow sat plotting his next moves, confident in his power over the town. In his cell, Michael kept his vigil of prayer, trusting in a higher justice. And in the cabin, Liza watched the snow fall and steeled herself for the fight ahead, knowing that truth, once spoken, could not be so easily buried, not even under a blanket of snow. The deeds in her satchel seemed to carry the weight of all their hopes, not just hers and Michael's, but the hopes of every family the judge had wronged. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, the snow fell, and prayers rose, and somewhere in the vast darkness between heaven and earth, justice waited to be done. Dawn crept over Silver Bluff, revealing a world transformed by snow. The early morning light sparkled across untouched drifts that blanketed the town in pristine white. Icicles hung from the eaves of buildings like crystal daggers, and chimney smoke rose straight into the still, cold air. Liza stood at the cabin window, watching the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. She had barely slept, spending most of the night in prayer and preparation. Now, wrapped in her warmest shawl and clutching her leather satchel close, she drew in a deep breath and opened the cabin door. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she set out toward town. The familiar path looked different under its white covering, but her steps were sure and determined. She kept her chin high, though her heart hammered in her chest. The deeds in her satchel felt like they weighed 100 pounds, but they gave her strength too, proof of truth that couldn't be denied. As she approached the edge of town, the first townsfolk were already out, shoveling paths between buildings. Heads turned at her approach, and the whispers began. Liza forced herself to keep walking, even as the cruel words reached her ears. "Look who's waddling into town," someone sneered from the doorway of the general store. "Judge's fat wife, thinking she's too good for him now. Heard she's living in sin with that trapper," another voice added. "Always knew she was no better than she ought to be." Liza's cheeks burned, but she didn't lower her gaze. The courthouse loomed ahead, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. Through the glass, she could see movement. People gathering for what promised to be quite a show. Judge Barrow would make sure of that. As she reached the courthouse steps, Sheriff Weller appeared at her elbow. "Judge wants to see you right away, Liza," he said, not unkindly. "Best come quiet-like." "I intended to," she replied steadily. "I have nothing to hide, Sheriff." Inside, the courthouse was already packed. It seemed half the town had turned out to witness her humiliation. Judge Barrow sat behind his massive desk, looking pleased as a cat with cream. His eyes glittered with malicious anticipation as Sheriff Weller led Liza to stand before him. "Well, well," Judge Barrow drawled, leaning back in his chair. "My wayward wife returns. Come to your senses at last, have you?" Liza stood straight, her hands clasped before her. "I've come because you summoned me, nothing more." The judge's face darkened. "You seem to have forgotten your place, woman. You belong to me by law and custom. This foolishness with the trapper ends now." He smiled, showing his teeth. "Come home where you belong, and I might be persuaded to show mercy to your mountain man." A ripple of whispers ran through the crowd. Liza felt their eyes on her, some pitying, some eager for her downfall. But something had changed in her during these past days with Michael. The shame that had weighted her down for so many years felt lighter somehow. "I belong to no man but God," she declared, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "You cast me aside yourself, husband, in front of witnesses. You mocked me, humiliated me, offered me like chattel to any man who'd take me." She took a step forward, growing stronger with each word. "Well, a good man did take me, not as property, but as a child of God deserving of dignity. I stand with Michael Pike, and I won't return to your house of cruelty." Judge Barrow's face turned purple with rage. He slammed his hand down on the desk. "You dare defy me? I'll see your precious trapper hang for theft, and you'll be known as nothing but a whore, living in sin with—" The only sin here, Liza cut in, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, is what you've done to this town and its people. God sees it all, Judge Barrow. Every deed, every lie, every act of abuse. You can't hide from his justice forever. The judge rose from his chair, spittle flying as he shouted, "Get out. Get out of my court, you worthless." But Liza was already turning away, walking with measured steps toward the door. The crowd parted before her, and though the whispers continued, she heard something new in them, respect, and maybe even a touch of admiration. Outside, she paused on the courthouse steps, breathing in the crisp winter air. Her legs felt weak, but her spirit soared. For the first time in years, she stood tall in her own truth, unbowed by the judge's threats or the town's scorn. Meanwhile, in the jail's cold confines, Michael sat on his thin mattress, sharing his breakfast bread with a young prisoner in the next cell. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, arrested for stealing food from the general store. "I ain't got no one," the boy mumbled, picking at the bread. "Pa died in the mines last year. Ma couldn't manage." His voice trailed off. Michael nodded, understanding. "The Lord hasn't forgotten you, son. Even here in this dark place, his mercy reaches us." The boy scoffed. "Mercy? Where's the mercy in this town? Judge will throw me in territorial prison sure as sunrise." "There's always hope," Michael said quietly. "I learned that lesson hard after my wife died. Thought I was done with life, done with people, wrapped myself in loneliness like a blanket. But God had other plans." He smiled slightly. "He has a way of working good from what looks like disaster. That lady they're all talking about, the judge's wife, she's with you now, ain't she?" the boy asked, curious despite himself. "Liza," Michael said, and there was reverence in how he spoke her name. "She's teaching me about dignity. Real dignity. The kind that comes from knowing who you are in God's eyes, not man's." The boy was quiet for a moment, considering. "Wish I had someone believe in me like that." "You do," Michael assured him. "God believes in you, and so do I." He reached through the bars, offering his hand. "Name's Michael Pike, and I reckon you and me could be friends." The boy hesitated, then took the offered hand. "Tommy Wells," he said softly. "Well, Tommy Wells, let me tell you about a God who specializes in fresh starts and second chances." As Michael shared his faith with the young prisoner, his thoughts turned to Liza. He could almost feel her presence in the town above, facing down the forces aligned against them. His prayers rose like smoke, joining hers in the cold winter air. In different places but united in spirit, husband and wife moved forward in their journey toward courage. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the town in its gentle blanket, while inside hearts and minds the seeds of change had begun to take root. Liza walked away from the courthouse, her steps leaving clear prints in the fresh snow. Behind her, the whispers and pointing continued, but they couldn't touch her now. She had found something stronger than fear, the certainty of God's love and her own worth. The path ahead would not be easy, but she would walk it with her head high, knowing she was no longer alone. The evening shadows stretched long across the jail cell floor as Michael sat on his thin mattress, his back against the cold stone wall. Through the barred window, he could see the last rays of sunlight painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. The cell felt colder now, but he had known worse during his years in the wilderness. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor, making Michael look up. Sheriff Weller appeared, keys jangling at his belt. Behind him walked a familiar figure, Reverend Yazzie, the Navajo preacher whose quiet wisdom had earned respect throughout the territory. "Got a visitor, Pike?" Weller announced gruffly. "Reverend here vouched for him. You got 15 minutes." The sheriff unlocked the cell door just enough to let Reverend Yazzie step inside, then locked it again and retreated to his desk at the end of the hall, deliberately out of earshot, but keeping watch. Reverend Yazzie stood tall in his black preacher's coat, his long dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His weathered face held both gentleness and strength as he regarded Michael. "Brother Pike," he said softly, "the peace of Christ be with you." "And with you, Reverend," Michael replied, standing to greet him. "It does my heart good to see a friendly face." The preacher settled onto the wooden stool, the cell's only other furniture, and studied Michael carefully. "I have heard what transpired with Judge Barrow and your wife Liza." The truth you both seek to reveal has stirred many hearts. Michael sank back onto his mattress, running a hand through his beard. Truth's a dangerous thing in this town, Reverend. The judge means to see me hang for it. Yet truth, like water, will find its way through a sawbar bow through any barrier, Reverend Yazzie said. His dark eyes held Michael's steady. My people know this well. We have seen how men like Judge Barrow twist the law to steal what is not theirs. Land, water, dignity itself. The deeds Liza found, Michael said quietly, they prove his crimes against both settlers and your people. But from behind these bars, I can't help her fight. Reverend Yazzie leaned forward. This is why I have come. I traveled tomorrow to Fort Collins, where the territorial marshal keeps his office. I can deliver your evidence, ensure it reaches those with authority to act. Hope stirred in Michael's chest. You'd do this? It could bring trouble on you and your congregation. The preacher's smile was gentle but determined. The Great Spirit and the God of Abraham both teach us to stand with those who seek justice. My people say that walking in beauty means walking in harmony with truth. He gestured to the cell around them. These walls cannot contain what is right, Brother Pike. Stay strong in your faith. You and Liza are not alone in this fight. Michael felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by this unexpected alliance. Thank you, Reverend. Your courage gives me strength. It is not courage that moves me, Reverend Yazzie replied, but the Spirit of Christ who calls us to love our neighbors and defend the oppressed. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, leather-bound Bible. The sheriff allowed me to bring this for you. May it comfort your hours here. Michael accepted the Bible reverently. God's word and your friendship, I couldn't ask for better gifts. The Reverend stood as Sheriff Weller's boots approached again. I will pray for you and Liza, he said. Remember, even in darkness, light persists. The dawn always comes. As Reverend Yazzie departed, Michael clutched the Bible to his chest, feeling its familiar weight. Though alone again in his cell, his spirit felt lighter. God had not abandoned them after all. Miles away, at Michael's cabin, Liza pulled her heavy wool shawl tighter against the bitter wind. Her breath frosted in the air as she urged her borrowed mare through the deepening snow. She had spent the entire day riding from ranch to ranch, speaking with families who had suffered under Judge Barrow's corrupt rule. The satchel at her side bulged with signed statements, testimonies of stolen water rights, forged documents, and coerced agreements. Each signature represented a life damaged by the judge's greed, a voice finally rising in protest. She thought of the widow Matthews living in near poverty after the judge seized her late husband's mining claim through false documents. The woman's hands had trembled as she signed her statement, but her eyes had blazed with long, suppressed anger. Then there were the Carson brothers, whose cattle had nearly died of thirst when the judge diverted their creek to serve his own interests. They had added their signatures without hesitation, offering Liza coffee and cornbread while they shared their story. Most moving had been her visit to the Thompson place, where Sarah Thompson, once a friend before the judge forbade such associations, had embraced Liza with tears. We've all been so wrong about you, Sarah had whispered. You're the bravest woman I know. Now, as darkness settled over the mountain, Liza guided her horse carefully along the snowy trail. The lantern swinging from her saddle cast jumping shadows through the trees. Her fingers were numb with cold, but her heart felt warm with purpose. Finally, the cabin came into view, dark and silent without Michael's presence. Liza dismounted stiffly, led the mare to the lean-to stable, and saw to the animal's comfort before heading inside. The cabin felt empty without Michael's quiet strength, but she refused to let loneliness overwhelm her. She built up the fire and lit the lamp, spreading the day's collected documents on the rough-hewn table. In the lamplight, she carefully organized them, making sure each signature was clear and dated. Her neat handwriting cataloged each statement, building a case that even the territorial courts couldn't ignore. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters. Liza pulled Michael's old quilt around her shoulders as she worked. The familiar scent of pine smoke and leather that clung to it reminded her of him, bringing both comfort and renewed determination. As the hour grew late, Liza finally set aside her work. She knelt beside Michael's bed, now hers, and clasped her hands in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "watch over Michael tonight. Let him feel your presence in that cold cell. And please, let him know somehow that I'm thinking of him, that I'm not giving up." She paused, remembering Michael's gentle ways, how he had given her dignity when others had stripped it away. "Thank you, Father, for sending him to me. For showing me I'm worth more than the judge's cruel words. Help us bring your justice to this town." Rising from her knees, Lisa moved to bank the fire for the night. The wind still moaned outside, but it no longer sounded lonely to her. Instead, she imagined it carrying her prayers to Michael, joining their hearts across the dark miles between them. "Good night, Michael," she whispered to the quiet cabin. "Stay strong. We're not alone anymore." She slipped beneath the quilt, and despite her worries, sleep came quickly. Her dreams were filled not with fear, but with hope. Hope for justice, for renewal, for a future where truth would finally prevail. Through the long night, the lamp burned low, casting its steady light over the gathered testimonies, evidence of courage found and voices finally raised against tyranny. And in his cell, Michael held his new Bible close, drawing strength from its promises of deliverance. Though separated by stone walls and snow-covered distance, husband and wife remained united in purpose and faith, their prayers rising together like smoke from a common fire reaching toward heaven's mercy. Dawn broke cold and gray over Silver Bluff, the morning sun struggling to pierce thick clouds heavy with snow. Caleb Hensley stood in the doorway of his barn, scanning the road for anyone who might notice the steady trickle of townspeople slipping through his gate. His weathered hands gripped the rough wood as he nodded to each arrival, ushering them quickly inside. "Round back through the hay door," he whispered to the widow Matthews as she hurried past. "Less chance of being seen that way." Inside the barn, lanterns cast warm circles of light through the musty air. The sweet scent of fresh hay mingled with the earthy smell of cattle. Townspeople gathered in small clusters, their breath visible in the cold as they spoke in hushed tones. Some perched on hay bales, others leaned against weathered support beams, all eyes fixed on Liza as she stood before them. She had positioned herself near Caleb's workbench, her satchel of documents laid out carefully. Though her hands trembled slightly, her voice rang clear and steady. "I know many of you took great risk coming here today," she began, "and I thank you for your courage." Sarah Thompson, wrapped in a thick shawl, stepped forward. "We're here because we trust you, Liza, and because we're tired of living under the judge's boot." Liza nodded, reaching into her satchel. "What I'm about to show you proves everything we've suspected about Judge Barrow." She withdrew a stack of papers, holding them up so all could see. "These are the original deeds and water rights agreements before my husband altered them." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Caleb moved to stand beside her, his presence lending support as she began to explain. "Here's the deed to the Carson brothers' water rights," she said, holding up one document. "See the original signature date? Now look at this version from the judge's files. The numbers have been changed, the terms altered. He did this to dozens of properties, always when owners were desperate or vulnerable." The Carson brothers pushed forward, their faces darkening as they examined their altered deed. "That snake," the elder brother growled. "He told us we had no choice but to sell when our cattle were dying of thirst. All along, he'd already stolen our water rights." Liza spread more documents across the workbench. Every altered deed, every forced sale, every false judgment. I recorded them all during my years as his clerk. He never thought I'd understand what I was copying. Never imagined his despised wife would be his undoing. Old Man Weber, who had lost his ranch to the judge 5 years earlier, stepped closer to examine the papers. His gnarled fingers traced the lines of text. "This here proves he cheated me," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Proves I wasn't just a fool who lost his land fair and square." "None of you were fools," Liza said firmly. "You were victims of a man who twisted the law to serve his greed, but now we have proof. Real proof that can't be ignored." "What good is proof?" someone called from the back. "The judge controls everything in this town. He's already got Michael locked up on false charges." "That's why we need to stand together," Liza replied. "Reverend Yazzie is taking copies of these documents to the territorial marshal today. But we need your testimonies too, your signatures declaring what was stolen from you." Sarah Thompson stepped forward first, her chin held high. "I'll sign." It's time someone stood up to that tyrant. One by one, others moved forward. The Carson brothers, Widow Matthews, Old Man Weber. Soon a line formed at the workbench as Liza recorded their statements and collected signatures. The scratch of her pen filled the quiet barn, punctuated by soft murmurs as people shared their stories of loss and injustice. But not everyone stepped forward. Some hung back in the shadows, fear evident in their stance. "The judge will destroy anyone who crosses him," one man warned. "He's done it before." "He can't destroy us all," Caleb countered. "Not if we stand united." I nearly lost everything to his schemes. But thanks to Liza and Michael bringing the truth to light, I've got hope again. Real hope for justice. Outside the barn, unknown to the gathered townspeople, two figures crouched in the winter shadows. The judge's hired men exchanged knowing looks as they counted each person who entered. Their horses waited in a nearby grove, ready to carry word back to Judge Barrow. Inside, Liza continued gathering signatures, her heart full as she witnessed the community coming together. Here was the answer to her prayers, not just resistance to the judge's corruption, but the healing of a town long fractured by fear and mistrust. "I know what it costs you to be here," she told them. "But remember, Michael sits in a jail cell right now because he dared to stand up for what's right. He saw worth in me when everyone else saw only shame. Now it's our turn to stand up, to see the worth in ourselves and in each other." Her words struck deep. More people stepped forward to sign. Even some who had held back began to move toward the workbench, courage kindling in their eyes. As the meeting drew to a close, Sarah Thompson began to hum softly, the opening notes of "Amazing Grace." Others joined in, the hymn swelling quietly through the barn. Liza's clear voice rose with them, her heart reaching across town to the jail cell where Michael waited. That night, as darkness settled over Silver Bluff, Michael dozed fitfully on his thin jail mattress. In his dreams, he heard singing, Liza's voice, pure and strong, lifting in praise. The melody seemed to wind through the iron bars, wrapping him in its comfort. He woke briefly, the echo of the hymn still in his mind. Though the cell was cold and dark, his heart felt warm. Somehow he knew Liza was thinking of him, perhaps even singing at that very moment. And she was. In the cabin, Liza sat by the fire, working by lamplight to organize the day's collected testimonies. As she worked, she sang softly, the same hymn from the barn meeting. Her voice filled the lonely cabin with hope, as she imagined Michael hearing her across the distance. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound," she sang, her fingers smoothing each precious signature. "That saved a wretch like me." The familiar words took on new meaning now, speaking of salvation not just of the soul, but of a community finding its way back to justice and truth. The wind picked up outside, rattling the cabin's shutters, but Liza felt no fear. The day's gathering had shown her they were not alone in this fight. God had brought her and Michael together for such a time as this, to help restore what greed and corruption had broken. She worked late into the night, carefully copying each testimony for Reverend Yazzie to carry to Fort Collins. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. But tonight, she let her voice rise in quiet praise, trusting that somehow its comfort reached Michael in his cell. In town, Judge Barrow's spies slipped into the saloon to deliver their report. Soon the judge would know who had dared to gather against him. But for this moment, hope and courage flowered in Silver Bluff. Fragile as the first spring blooms, but just as determined to push through winter's grip. Sheriff Elias Weller shifted his weight from one boot to the other, standing before Judge Barrow's massive oak desk. The morning sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows, but the darkness in the judge's eyes made the sheriff more uneasy than any shadow. "What do you mean the town is stirring?" Barrow's fingers drummed against his desk, each tap like a hammer strike in the quiet room. "There was a meeting yesterday, sir. At the Hensley place." Weller removed his hat, twisting the brim. "Near 20 folks showed up. My men saw them going in and out all afternoon." Judge Barrow's face reddened. He shoved back from his desk, the chair legs scraping against wooden floorboards. "Names. I want names." The Carson brothers were there. Old Man Weber. Widow Matthews, Sarah Thompson. Weller recited the list his deputies had provided. And your Liza. She was leading it all, showing papers to folks. The judge's fist crashed down on his desk, making inkwells jump. That fat cow thinks she can turn my own town against me? He stalked to the window, glaring out at the street below. And Pike, rotting in his cell, probably put her up to it. What do you want me to do? Weller asked, though he dreaded the answer. Barrow turned, a cruel smile twisting his lips. These people need to learn what happens when they cross me. Send word to Wade and his boys. Tell them I've got work that pays well. No questions asked. Wade's bunch? Weller's stomach churned. They're nothing but thugs, Judge. They dash. Exactly what I need right now. Barrow cut him off. Sometimes a few examples need to be made. For the greater good, of course. The sheriff nodded weakly, knowing protest was useless. He left the courthouse, the weight of what was coming settling heavy on his shoulders. That evening, as darkness crept across Silver Bluff, Wade and his men gathered in the back room of the saloon. Judge Barrow passed out coins and whiskey, along with his instructions. The thugs grinned at the simple task: light a few fires, scare a few farmers, easy money. The night was moonless, perfect for their work. They split into groups, riding out to the targeted ranches. The Hensley place was first. Caleb's barn went up like tinder, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky. Martha Hensley spotted the glow through their cabin window. "Fire!" she screamed, rousing her family. "The barn's burning." 2 miles away, Liza jerked awake at the sound of pounding on her door. Sarah Thompson stood there, breathless. "The Hensley's barn, it's ablaze, and the Carson place too." Liza grabbed her shawl, not bothering to change from her nightdress. "Saddle the mule," she ordered, already moving to gather buckets. "We have to help." They rode hard through the darkness, the burning barns lighting their way like beacons of hatred. When they reached the Hensley farm, chaos reigned. Cattle bellowed in terror, while men formed bucket lines from the well to the flames. Without hesitation, Liza joined the line, passing heavy buckets hand to hand. Her arms ached, but she didn't stop. Martha worked beside her, both women's faces streaked with soot. "The hayloft," someone shouted. "It's going to collapse." Liza saw young Tommy Hensley, only 12, still trying to lead horses from the burning structure. She ran forward, grabbing his arm. "Out! Now!" They barely cleared the doorway when burning timbers crashed behind them. Sparks showered Liza's dress, small holes appearing in the fabric. She beat them out with her hands, ignoring the sting of minor burns. "My horses," Tommy sobbed. Pa's best mare was still inside. Liza held him close, her heart breaking. "Hush now. You're safe. That's what matters." Through the night, they fought flames at 3 different ranches. By dawn, Liza's dress was ruined, her hands blistered, but she kept working. As the sun rose, she helped Martha salvage what they could from the smoking ruins of the barn. "Why?" Martha asked, voice rough from smoke. "Why would anyone do this?" "The judge," Liza answered grimly. "He's showing us what happens to those who stand against him." Martha gripped Liza's shoulder. "And then he's shown us exactly why we must keep standing." "Look around." Liza did. Despite the destruction, something beautiful had emerged. Neighbors who had stayed away from yesterday's meeting were here now, helping without question. Women who had once whispered about her size now worked beside her as equals. She saw respect in their eyes, not mockery. "We always thought you were just the judge's shadow," Old Man Weber said, bringing her a dipper of water. "But you've got more spine than most men I know." Liza sipped the cool water, remembering how these same people had laughed at her in the courthouse such a short time ago. Now they looked to her for leadership. God did work in mysterious ways. At the jail, Michael paced his cell as morning light crept through the barred window. He had been awake all night, hearing the commotion, seeing the distant glow of flames. But none of the deputies would tell him what was burning. Finally, young Deputy Collins came to bring breakfast. The boy had a kind heart, unlike most of Weller's men. "Please," Michael said quietly. "What happened last night?" Collins glanced around, then whispered, 3 barns burned. The Hensleys, Carsons, and Webbers. Your wife was there, helping fight the fires." Michael's hands clenched the bars. "Was anyone hurt?" "No deaths, thank the Lord," but Collins hesitated. Miss Liza got a bit scorched. Nothing serious, he added quickly, seeing Michael's face. She's still out there, helping folks clean up. Michael bowed his head, pride and fear warring in his heart. His brave Liza rushing toward danger instead of away. He wanted desperately to protect her, yet here he sat, useless behind bars while she fought their battles. She's something special, your wife, Colin said softly. Half the town's talking about how she worked all night, giving orders and comfort like she was born to it. Even my pa says she's got sand, and he don't praise folks easy. Michael's prayer was simple but fervent. Keep her safe, Lord. Give her strength, and help me find a way to stand beside her soon. Back at the Hensley farm, Liza finally sat down on an overturned bucket, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. Her scorched dress stuck to her skin, and every muscle screamed in protest. Martha brought her a cup of coffee and a biscuit. You need to rest. So do you, Liza countered, but accepted the food gratefully. I've been thinking, Martha said, settling beside her. The judge meant these fires to frighten us into submission. But look what they've done instead. Liza surveyed the scene. Dozens of people worked together, clearing debris and already planning how to rebuild. Children carried water to thirsty workers. Women organized food and supplies. The community had come alive, united in crisis. He thought he would break us, Liza said. Instead, he's made us stronger. Thanks to you. Martha squeezed her hand. You showed us what real courage looks like, not with speeches or threats, but by working beside us, sharing our burden. Liza thought of Michael in his cell, how his quiet strength had first awakened her own. Sometimes God uses the most unlikely people to do his work. Ain't that the truth, Martha smiled. Who would have thought the judge's despised wife would become the one person this town trusts most? A wagon rattled up the road, bringing more helpers and supplies. Liza rose, ready to direct the new arrivals, but Martha held her back. Rest a bit longer, she insisted. We can manage. You've done enough for now. Liza sank back down, watching the sunrise paint the smoke-filled sky in shades of pink and gold. Her thoughts turned to Michael, missing his steady presence beside her. But she felt him in spirit, drawing strength from the memory of his gentle ways and firm resolve. In town, Sheriff Weller stood in his office staring at the wanted posters on his wall, without really seeing them. The sound of Judge Barrow's laughter drifted up from the saloon below, celebrating his night of destruction. The sheriff's hand strayed to his badge, touching the star that had once made him proud. When had he become nothing but a tool for corruption? When had he lost the courage to stand for what was right? He thought of Liza Barrow Pike working through the night to save her neighbors' livestock and livelihoods. She had found her courage. Perhaps it wasn't too late for him to find his. The morning wore on, and Silver Bluff slowly came to terms with the night's violence. But instead of cowering in fear as Judge Barrow had intended, the town drew together. Bonds forged in crisis proved stronger than the fears that had kept them apart. And at the center of it all stood Liza, her scorched dress and soot-stained face badges of honor that earned her more respect than any fine clothing ever had. She had proved herself not just strong, but a true leader, one who served rather than dominated, who built up instead of tearing down. The judge's attempt to crush opposition had backfired spectacularly. Where he had sought to plant fear, he had instead harvested unity. Where he had tried to demonstrate his power, he had revealed its limitations. And where he had hoped to diminish Liza, he had only proved her worth. The winter storm howled through Silver Bluff like a hungry wolf. Inside the jail, Michael huddled against the cold stone wall, his breath visible in the dim light. Sheriff Weller had let the wood stove die hours ago, leaving the prisoners to weather the freezing night alone. Can't feel my feet no more, young Billy Thompson whispered from the next cell. The boy had been jailed for stealing a loaf of bread, his family near starving after the judge seized their land. Michael shifted closer to the bars between them, huddled together with Jenkins' boy. Share what warmth you can. The cell block held 5 men total, all victims of the judge's twisted justice. Michael watched them shivering, their thin blankets offering little protection against the bitter cold. He thought of Liza, praying she was safe at the cabin. Let's pray together, Michael said, his voice carrying through the darkness. It'll keep our spirits warm, if not our bodies. One by one, the men joined in. their voices growing stronger as they shared familiar hymns and prayers. Even old Jenkins, who claimed no faith, hummed along. The sound seemed to push back the darkness, creating a small sphere of comfort in their frozen prison. Meanwhile, Liza struggled through knee-deep snow, following the old post road toward Mason's Creek. The territorial marshal's courier would stop there tonight, her only chance to get the evidence to higher authorities. The wind cut through her heavy coat like knives, but she pressed on, clutching her precious satchel of documents. Just one more mile, she told herself, though her legs trembled with exhaustion. Keep moving. The blizzard had erased all landmarks, turning the world into a swirling white void. Liza followed the line of telegraph poles, counting them to track her progress. 20 poles meant 1 mile. She had counted 15 when her foot caught in a hidden hole. She pitched forward into the snow, the cold stealing her breath. For a moment she lay there, despair threatening to overwhelm her. But Michael's face appeared in her mind, waiting in that cold cell, trusting her to complete their mission. "Get up," she commanded herself. "Get up now." Suddenly, a lantern light pierced the whiteness. A figure approached, calling her name. "Miss Liza." "Over here." It was Sarah Hensley, Caleb's 16-year-old daughter, wrapped in a heavy shawl. The girl helped Liza to her feet, supporting her through the final stretch to the farmhouse. "Pa sent me to watch for you," Sarah explained as they stumbled toward the welcoming light. "Said you'd need help in this weather." Inside, blessed warmth enveloped Liza. Her frozen fingers tingled painfully as she clutched a cup of hot coffee. Through the frosted windows, she watched the courier's wagon approach right on schedule, the horses struggling through deep drifts. "You're certain these will reach the marshal?" Liza asked as she handed over the carefully wrapped package of deeds and testimonies. The courier, a weathered man named Morton, tucked the documents securely in his oilskin pouch. "I've never failed to deliver in 15 years of service, ma'am. Storm or no storm." "Godspeed you safely," Liza whispered as he mounted up and disappeared into the howling white. Back at the jail, Michael led another prayer, his voice hoarse from hours of singing and encouragement. The cold had settled into his bones, but he refused to let it defeat his spirit. "The Lord is my shepherd," he recited, the familiar words bringing comfort. "I shall not want." The other prisoners joined in, their voices growing stronger with each verse. Even Sheriff Weller, passing through on his rounds, paused to listen, something like shame crossing his face. In the Hensley farmhouse, Liza finally allowed exhaustion to claim her. Sarah helped her into the spare bedroom, where a fire blazed welcomingly in the hearth. "You rest now," Sarah insisted, tucking warm quilts around her. "Pa says you've done more than enough for one day." Liza's last thoughts before sleep took her were of Michael, hoping he could feel her love reaching across the storm-filled miles between them. She had done what needed doing. Now they could only wait and pray that justice would arrive before the judge's cruelty claimed any more victims. The blizzard raged on through the night, but it could not touch the hope that burned in Liza's heart. She had risked everything to get those documents through, fighting nature itself to see justice done. Let the storm howl. She was stronger than any wind that blew. In his cold cell, Michael smiled slightly, feeling Liza's determination even through stone walls and swirling snow. They were apart, but united in purpose, and neither ice nor iron could break that bond. "The Lord is my strength and my shield," he whispered into the darkness. "In him my heart trusts." Around him, the other prisoners slept fitfully, huddled together for warmth. But their spirits remained unbroken, thanks to Michael's unwavering faith and quiet leadership. Even in the coldest night, hope burned on. The evidence was on its way at last, carried by a faithful courier through the raging storm. Soon, God willing, truth would shine light into the darkest corners of Silver Bluff, exposing the judge's crimes for all to see. 3 days after the blizzard, the mountain sun emerged fierce and bright, melting the deep drifts into muddy rivers down Silver Bluff's streets. The town buzzed with whispers that made Judge Barrow's face turn purple with rage. Word had spread that territorial marshals were riding toward town, bearing documents and warrants. Inside the courthouse, Barrow slammed his fist on the polished oak desk. "Weller, get in here." The sheriff slunk into the office, his badge gleaming dully in the winter light. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. "Those papers that fat woman stole," Barrow snarled, spittle flying. "If they reach the territory court, we're finished. Pike has to hang before they arrive." Sheriff Weller shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we ain't got proper cause for treason." Barrow's voice boomed through the courthouse. "He stole government documents. He turned honest folks against lawful authority. Build the gallows, Weller. Tomorrow morning we end this." Outside in the muddy street, Liza heard the judge's shouts echo through the courthouse windows. Her heart clenched, but she forced herself to walk steadily toward the jail. She would not give the townspeople watching from shop windows the satisfaction of seeing her run. The jail smelled of damp stone and unwashed bodies. Michael sat on his thin bunk, beard grown long, cheeks hollow from weeks of poor rations. But his eyes still held that steady light that had first drawn Liza to trust him. "Michael," she whispered, pressing close to the iron bars. Tears spilled down her cheeks, freezing in the cold air. "They're building gallows." He reached through the bars to touch her hand. His fingers were rough but warm, and Liza felt strength flow between them. "Don't fear for me," Michael said softly. "The Lord knows his plan. Truth will prevail." "I won't let them hang you," Liza's voice grew fierce. "I'll ride for the marshal myself if I have to. Or break you out. Or dash. "Hush now." Michael squeezed her hand. "No breaking laws, even unjust ones. We've come this far in righteousness. We'll see it through the same way." Through the barred window, weak sunlight cast grid-shaped shadows across their joined hands. The moment felt holy somehow, like a prayer made visible. "Your faith gave me courage," and Liza told him. "When everyone saw me as worthless, you showed me dignity. I won't stand idle while they try to kill that light." Michael's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "You had that courage all along, Liza. God just helped you find it." He pressed his palm flat against hers through the bars. "Feel that? Two hearts beating with the same truth. They can't hang that." Outside, they heard hammering as the gallows took shape in the town square. Each blow echoed like thunder, but neither Michael nor Liza flinched. Their hands remained joined, warm despite the winter chill, steady despite the fear trying to shake them. "I'll be back," Liza promised, "and whatever happens, you're not alone." "I know," Michael said simply. "God is with us both." She held his gaze a moment longer, memorizing the quiet strength in his face. Then she turned and walked out, spine straight, head high. The sound of hammering followed her into the street, but it couldn't drown out the steady drumbeat of faith in her heart. God's justice was coming, she would make sure of it. Morning sunlight glinted off the gallows' fresh-cut timber as Judge Barrow called the courthouse to order. Townsfolk packed the benches, their faces grim. Michael stood in chains before the judge's bench, his back straight despite weeks in the cold jail. "We gather to try this man for crimes against," Judge Barrow began, but heavy boots thundered on the courthouse steps. The double doors burst open. A tall man in a marshal's duster strode in, flanked by 6 deputies with rifles. Silver badges caught the light streaming through dusty windows. "This court is now suspended," the marshal announced, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "By order of the territorial governor." Judge Barrow's face purpled. "How dare you interrupt Quiet." The marshal's word cracked like a whip. "We received evidence of extensive corruption in this jurisdiction." He turned to the crowd. "Is Liza Barrow Pike present?" Liza rose from the back bench, clutching her leather satchel. The townspeople parted as she walked forward, her steps steady, despite her racing heart. Gone was the shame that once made her shrink from attention. She met the marshal's eyes squarely. "Sir," she said, "I have the original deeds and witness statements here." She placed the satchel on the evidence table, hands trembling slightly as she withdrew the papers. "These show how Judge Barrow forged documents and extorted water rights from honest ranchers." The marshal examined the papers while his deputies kept watch. Judge Barrow gripped his gavel, knuckles white. "You'll hang for this," he hissed at Michael. "Both of you will." "The only one facing judgment today is you, Barrow," the marshal cut in. He held up a stack of signed statements. 50 witnesses detail your crimes, forged deeds, fabricated charges, bribes. He nodded to his deputies. "Take him into custody." 2 lawmen advanced on the bench. Judge Barrow lurched to his feet, sending his chair crashing backward. "Weller," he shouted. Stop them! Sheriff Weller stood by the wall, badge gleaming dully. He looked at the judge, then at Michael and Liza, and slowly shook his head. Shame colored his weathered face as he stepped aside. The deputies seized Judge Barrow's arms. He thrashed and cursed as they dragged him from the bench. "You can't do this. I am the law here." "Not anymore," the marshal said coldly. He turned to Michael. "Remove those chains. This man is free." The sound of shackles falling echoed through the courthouse. For a moment, perfect silence held. Then cheers erupted from the crowd. Families embraced, some weeping with joy. Years of fear and oppression shattered like ice in spring thaw. Liza ran to Michael, her heart pounding. He caught her in his arms, holding her close as townsfolk pressed around them with congratulations and thanks. She breathed in his familiar scent of pine and leather, feeling his strength enfold her. "You did it," Michael whispered against her hair. "You brought justice." "We did it," Liza corrected, smiling through tears, "together." Outside, they heard Judge Barrow's shouts fade as the deputies loaded him into a prison wagon. His power over Silver Bluff was finished, broken forever by truth and courage. The marshal approached them, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Ma'am, sir, the territory thanks you both. Takes rare courage to stand against corruption." Liza and Michael stood hand in hand as sunshine streamed through the courthouse windows, casting away the last shadows of fear. Around them, the town rejoiced, free at last to embrace hope and justice once more. That evening, lantern light spilled golden through the church's windows onto the freshly swept wooden floor. The little building overflowed with townsfolk, their faces bright with joy and wonder. Children perched on parents' laps while ranchers stood shoulder to shoulder with Navajo neighbors along the walls. Michael Pike waited at the front, his threadbare suit brushed clean, his weathered face transformed by quiet happiness. When Liza appeared in the doorway wearing a borrowed blue dress and carrying mountain wildflowers, tears gleamed in his eyes. Reverend Yazzie stood before them, his calm voice carrying to every corner. "Today we witness how God's love redeems and restores dignity to all his children," he said, switching between English and Diné Bizad so all could understand. "Through these two, he has brought justice and unity to our town." The congregation joined in singing Amazing Grace, their voices rising pure and strong through the rafters. When Michael and Liza exchanged their vows, their voices trembled with emotion. "I promise to cherish and honor you," Michael said softly, while Liza's answering "I do" rang with certainty and joy. Candlelight flickered across faces that had once sneered but now shone with respect and celebration. The very community that had mocked them now stood as witnesses to their love, transformed by the power of dignity and faith. Golden morning light streamed through the cabin windows, catching the fresh-picked wildflowers that filled every jar and tin cup. Wedding gifts from neighbors, hand-sewn quilts, preserved fruits, and fresh-baked breads covered the rough-hewn table where Michael and Liza shared their first breakfast as husband and wife. "Never thought I'd see this place so full of beauty," Michael said softly, watching Liza pour coffee into their chipped cups. The cabin felt transformed not just by the gifts, but by her presence that had slowly filled every corner with warmth. Outside, voices carried on the crisp winter air. Through the window, they could see ranchers gathering by the creek, already working together to mark out fair water shares. Caleb Hensley's deep laugh rang out as he showed the others where to set the boundary stones. "You gave me hope again, Liza," Michael said, reaching across the table to take her hand. His voice was rough with emotion. "When Sarah died, I thought that part of me was gone forever." Tears glistened in Liza's eyes, "And you showed me what true love means, not ownership or mockery, but honor and respect." She squeezed his hand. "God brought healing to both of us." Together they stepped out onto the porch, their fingers intertwined. The winter sunlight sparkled on fresh snow, and smoke rose peaceful and straight from chimney after chimney across the valley. From town, church bells began to ring, their clear tones carrying over the mountains like a blessing. Michael drew Liza close as they watched their community embrace this new morning. Where there had been strife, now there was trust. Where there had been loneliness, now there was love. The promise of justice and mercy had bloomed even in winter's heart. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.